It's strange how some stories stay with us long after childhood. You hear them when you're young, you see them in bright colors, you remember the characters, the songs, the magic, and you never question them. Because when we're children, stories are simple. A curious girl, a magical world, a strange adventure. But something happens as we grow older. We revisit those old same stories, and suddenly they feel different. Little details start to stand out. Moments that once felt silly now feel unsettling. And sometimes when you look closely enough, you realize the story hiding underneath the one you remembered is far darker than you'd ever imagined. Alice in Wonderland is one of those stories. At first glance, it feels harmless. A curious girl follows a rabbit into a magical world where logic makes no sense. But the deeper you go into Wonderland, the stranger the story becomes. Because Wonderland isn't just whimsical, it's chaotic, unstable. A world where logic collapses and time itself refuses to move forward. And when you begin digging into the real history behind the story, the girl who inspired Alice, the mysterious life of Lewis Caroll, the missing pages from his diary, and the unsettling origins of characters like the Mad Hatter and the Cheshire Cat, Wonderland begins to feel less like a children's fantasy and more like a dream that slowly turns into something darker. So tonight, we're stepping into Wonderland, but not the cheerful version you remember. Tonight, we're exploring the darker truth hiding behind this story. I'm Midnite Megan, and tonight, we're going down the rabbit hole. Before Wonderland was a book, before it became one of the most famous stories in the world, there was a real little girl. Her name was Alice Liddell. She lived in Oxford, England in the mid-1800s. Her father was Henry Liddell, the Dean of Christ Church. And in the quiet academic halls of that college worked a shy mathematics lecturer named Charles Ludwig Dodson. You know him by the name he later wrote under, Lewis Caroll. Dodson was brilliant, a mathematician, a man fascinated with order, patterns, and puzzles, which makes the chaotic world of Alice even stranger. But despite his academic mind, Dodson was known to be extremely shy around adults. Children, however, were different. He found them easier to talk to, more imaginative, more curious, and among the children he spent time with, Alice Liddell became one of his favorites. He would entertain Alice and her sisters with stories during outings and picnics. And on one summer afternoon in 1862, those stories changed literacy history. Dodson was rowing a boat down the river Thames with Alice and her sisters. To pass the time during the long trip, he began telling them a story about a girl named Alice, a girl who became bored while sitting beside her sister, until she sees a white rabbit wearing a waistcoat and carrying a pocket watch. A rabbit who mutters to himself, "Oh dear, I shall be late." The girls were fascinated, but Alice loved the story more than anyone. And when the boat ride ended, she begged Dotson to write it down. Months later, he gave her a handwritten manuscript titled Alice's Adventures Underground. That manuscript eventually grew into the book we know now as Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. But behind that charming origin story, there's a mystery that historians still debate today, because the relationship between Lewis Caroll and the Liddell family ended suddenly in 1863. And the reason why may have been written in pages that no longer exist. Lewis Caroll kept detailed diaries for much of his life, pages filled with observations, thoughts, and daily events. But when historians examined those diaries, they discovered something strange. Several pages were missing, not damaged, not faded, removed, carefully cut out. And one of those missing sections covers a crucial moment in 1863. Around the time Caroll's relationship with the Liddell family abruptly changed. For years, historians wondered what those pages might have contained. Eventually, a note surfaced written by relatives who had read the missing entry before it disappeared. The note suggested the conflict may have involved gossip, possibly involving Caroll, the children's governess, and members of the Liddell family. But the details remain unclear, and because the original diary pages are gone, the full truth may never be known. Some scholars believe the situation was simply a misunderstanding amplified by strict Victorian social expectations. Others believe something more complicated happened behind those closed doors. But the missing pages left a permanent shadow over the story of Wonderland, a mystery that still lingers today. And once you know that part of the story, Wonderland itself begins to feel a little different. Because Alice isn't just a fictional character, she's the reflection of a real child whose connection to the author became part of one of literature's most enduring mysteries. Now let's step into the story itself. Alice is sitting beside her sister on a quiet afternoon. Her sister is reading a book, but the book has no pictures, no conversations, but Alice quickly grows bored. She wonders what the point of a book could possibly be if it doesn't have pictures or dialogue. And as her mind begins to wander, she sees something strange. A rabbit running past her. Now that alone wouldn't be unusual, but this rabbit is wearing a waistcoat. He pulls out a pocket watch and he mutters to himself, oh dear, I shall be late." Now imagine that moment, a rabbit dressed like a person, checking the time, talking to himself. Most people would freeze. Some might question their sanity, but Alice does something very different. She follows him straight into the rabbit hole. And that's when Wonderland truly begins. Alice doesn't tumble the way you might expect. Instead, she falls slowly, almost as if gravity itself has forgotten to work. The tunnel stretches endlessly downward, and as she falls, Alice begins to notice something strange. The walls aren't just dirt and stone, they're lined with shelves. Books, maps, glass jars, paintings. It's as if the rabbit hole isn't just a tunnel through the ground, but a passage through someone else's world. Alice even has time to wonder how deep she might be fallen. She thinks about geography lessons, how far she might be from the center of the earth. The moment almost feels calm, dreamlike, but that calm doesn't last forever, because once she finally lands, Wonderland begins twisting reality around her. The first thing Alice discovers is a small golden key. The key opens a tiny door that leads to a beautiful garden, but the doorway is far too small for her to fit in. Then she finds the bottle labeled "Drink Me." After drinking it, Alice begins to shrink. Moments later, she finds a cake labeled "Eat Me," and suddenly she grows again, larger than the room itself. Her size changes, her surroundings change. Nothing remains stable. And slowly Alice begins realizing something important about Wonderland. This place doesn't follow rules. Not the rules of physics, not the rules of logic, not even the rules of identity. And the deeper she goes into Wonderland, the more that sense of instability begins to grow. Eventually, Alice encounters a strange figure sitting calmly on a giant mushroom, a blue caterpillar, smoking from a hookah pipe, watching her silently. Then he asks a question, a simple question, but one that Alice suddenly finds impossible to answer. Who are you? At first, the question seems harmless, but Alice struggles to respond because after shrinking, growing, changing again and again, she's no longer sure who she is. She tells the caterpillar she feels different, that she can't quite explain who she is anymore, and the caterpillar offers very little comfort. Instead, he simply continues smoking his pipe and speaking in riddles. This moment in the story has fascinated literacy scholars for years because the caterpillar represents a theme that runs through Wonderland: identity. Alice's size changes constantly. Her surroundings change. The people she meets behave irrationally. And slowly, she begins to lose the sense of who she is. Some psychologists believe this reflects the confusion of childhood. Others believe it reflects the way Lewis Caroll himself saw identity as fluid and uncertain. Either way, the deeper Alice travels into Wonderland, the less certain she becomes about herself. Eventually, Alice encounters one of the most famous scenes in Wonderland, the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. The table is covered with teacups. The March Hare shouts out nonsense. A sleepy dormouse drifts in and out of consciousness. And the Hatter himself speaks in riddles that make almost no sense at all. But the strangest part of the scene isn't the nonsense, it's time, or rather the absence of time. The Hatter explains that he once offended time himself, and as a punishment, time has stopped moving for him. It is always 6 o'clock and always tea time, which means the tea party never ends. They simply move around the table as cups become dirty, an endless loop, and there's a darker truth behind the character of the Mad Hatter. In the 1800s, hat makers used mercury during the felt making process. Over time, the mercury poisoned their nervous system. Hatters developed tremors, mood swings, memory problems, hallucinations, and eventually, many of them lost their sanity, which is where the phrase mad as a hatter came from. Lewis Carroll turned that disturbing reality into one of Wonderland's most memorable characters. A man trapped in madness, in a world where time itself refuses to move forward. Then there's the Cheshire Cat, perhaps the most mysterious character in Wonderland, unlike the others. The Cheshire Cat never seems confused by the chaos around him. He appears suddenly, often sitting on tree branches or floating in the air, and when he disappears, he fades slowly. First the body, then the head, until only the grin remains, watching. The phrase grinning like a Cheshire cat existed long before the story. It likely came from the carvings of smiling cats in Cheshire, England, where Lewis Carroll grew up. But in Wonderland, the Cheshire cat becomes something more philosophical. When Alice asks which direction she should go, the cat replies with a line that has puzzled readers for generations. If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. The Cheshire cat seems to understand something Alice doesn't, that Wonderland itself has no real direction. It's a place without logic, without structure, without certainty. Eventually, Alice reaches the royal court of Wonderland, and there she meets the Queen of Hearts. A ruler obsessed with control, her temper is legendary, and her solution to every problem is the same: off with their heads! Servants, guards, even guests. One mistake is all it takes. Historians believe the Queen may have been inspired by the authoritarian style of Victorian leadership, possibly even Queen Victoria herself. But in Wonderland, the Queen represents something larger: the absurdity of power, a ruler issuing commands that no one is questioning, even when they make no sense. In Wonderland, authority itself becomes chaotic. When you step back and look at Wonderland as a whole, it begins to feel less like a cheerful fantasy and more like a strange, psychological landscape. A girl wandering through a world where nothing behaves logically. Her size changes, her identity becomes uncertain. The people around her behave irrationally. Time stops, rules collapse. Some literacy scholars believe Wonderland represents the confusion of growing up. Others believe it reflects the strange, non-linear logic of dreams. And some believe Lewis Carroll was exploring something deeper about the instability of perception itself. Because when you remove the nonsense and humor, Wonderland becomes something unsettling, a world where reality cannot be trusted. Eventually, Alice stands in a courtroom, the Queen presiding over a trial that makes absolutely no sense. Witnesses speak nonsense, evidence means nothing. The verdict seems decided before the trial even begins. And suddenly Alice realizes something. The entire world around her is ridiculous. She grows larger, she challenges the Queen, and suddenly the entire court begins turning into nothing more than a deck of cards. They swirl around her, flying through the air, until everything collapses and Alice wakes up, back beside her sister on the quiet riverbank where the story began. was it just a dream or something stranger? Because Wonderland never fully feels finished. It lingers like a place that still exists somewhere just beyond the edge of reality. Stories change when we grow older. The ones that once felt magical sometimes reveal something darker hiding beneath them. Alice in Wonderland may look like a whimsical childhood adventure, but when you examine the real history behind the story, the strange mind of its author, and the mysteries that still surround the girl who inspired it, Wonderland begins to feel very different, almost as if Alice didn't just fall into a fantasy, but into a world where reality itself had started to break. If you enjoyed tonight's episode and want to keep exploring the darker sides of the tales we grew up with, make sure you follow the podcast on Spotify and subscribe on YouTube so you don't miss the next story waiting in the shadows. I'm Midnite Megan, and remember, the stories you loved as a child often hide in the darkest truths. Good night.